Imagine a desolate, frigid shoreline, no evidence of civilization in sight. Yet here, embedded in the sands, lie the faded traces of human life. In January 1985, on Yamana Beach at Cape Shiref, Livingston Island, long before Antarctica was even formally mapped, a lone skull emerged from the rocky outcrop. The remains belong to a woman not ancient in the conventional sense, but her story is as mysterious as it is unexpected. A mestizo woman, barely 20 years old, who died between 1819 and 1825, likely caught in the undertow of early 19th century sealing expeditions. These bones predate documented sightings of Antarctica, raising haunting questions. Who was she? How did she end up on these shores, far from settled lands? And what can her remains tell us about human encounters with a continent we once believed utterly uninhabited? Her discovery invites us to rethink not just exploration, but the forgotten lives that intersect with the edges of history. For much of human history, Antarctica existed more in the realm of speculation than reality. Ancient geographers imagined a massive southern continent, the Terra Australis Incognita, balancing the known lands of the north. Maps of the 16th and 17th centuries often featured this vast blank expanse at the bottom of the world, an imagined landmass that no one had yet seen. It wasn't until the early 19th century that explorers began pushing southward in earnest, driven by trade, whaling, and sealing. By the late 1700s, sealing had become a lucrative but brutal industry. The demand for fur and oil sent vessels deeper into uncharted waters, often operating at the very edge of the known world. When Captain James Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle in 1773, he confirmed the existence of ice-choked seas but saw no land. His reports discouraged further voyages for decades, as he described the region as inhospitable and barren, unfit for human settlement or economic gain. Yet commerce has a way of disregarding warnings. By the early 1800s, the sealing industry expanded toward the South Shetland Islands, north of the Antarctic Peninsula. These islands, lying just outside the frozen continent proper, became staging grounds for sealers chasing fortune. The year 1819 marked a turning point. Several sealing captains reported landfall in the South Shetlands, sparking a rush of expeditions. Crews, often multinational, included not just sailors and hunters, but sometimes stowaways, laborers, and in rare cases, women traveling under unusual circumstances. This was a time before the idea of Antarctica, as we know it, truly existed. Maps were still uncertain, records inconsistent, and voyages perilous. Ships often disappeared without trace. Those who ventured south endured isolation, extreme cold, and dangerous seas, all for the chance of profit. Against this backdrop, the discovery of a woman's remains on Livingston Island takes on added weight. If she died between 1819 and 1825, her presence predates formal documentation of human activity in the region. She is not just a curiosity of archaeology. She is a reminder that the earliest human footprints in Antarctica may belong not to explorers recorded in history books, but to forgotten individuals swept along by the currents of commerce and chance. In January of 1985, a small Chilean scientific team working on Livingston Island in the South Shetlands made a startling find. At Yamana Beach, Cape Shiref, among the rocks and scattered remains of seals, they uncovered a human skull. Its placement was unusual, partially buried, eroded by wind and sea, lying far from any settlement or known burial site. In a region where human history was thought to be minimal, the discovery came as an anomaly. The skull was carefully recovered and taken for study. Initial impressions revealed that it did not belong to a recent victim of shipwreck or accident, but was much older. Further examination showed traits consistent with a young adult woman, likely in her early 20s. Forensic details, slight wear on the teeth, bone structure, and the absence of signs of advanced age, supported this conclusion. Later, fragments of femur found in the same area were matched to her, confirming that the remains belonged to one individual. What shocked researchers most was the dating. Radiocarbon analysis placed the remains between 1819 and 1825. This was precisely the period when sealing vessels first reached the South Shetlands. The timing was so close to the earliest records of human activity in the region that her presence seemed almost impossible. She had died, it appeared, at the very edge of history, at the very moment Antarctica was entering the maps of the world. The skull's discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why was a young woman with indigenous South American ancestry present in a place largely dominated by male sealers? Was she traveling with a crew, willingly or otherwise? Was she cast ashore after death, or left behind under tragic circumstances? The absence of burial structure suggested her remains had been scattered by natural forces, not carefully interred. For the Chilean team, the find was more than a curiosity. It was evidence that Antarctica's human story was far older and more complex than once assumed. The continent, long believed untouched until the modern age of exploration, now carried the silent trace of a forgotten life. Once the skull and femur fragments were secured for study, forensic anthropologists began piecing together the identity of this mysterious woman. The skeletal evidence offered only fragments of a life, but careful analysis provided telling details. She was young, likely between 19 and 23 years of age, when she died. Her skull displayed features consistent with a mestizo background, meaning she likely had both European and indigenous South American ancestry. This finding pointed strongly toward an origin in South America, perhaps from the southern coasts of Chile or Argentina, where sealing ships recruited crews and sometimes carried non-European passengers. Examination of her teeth suggested a diet that combined maritime resources with foods typical of coastal South America, again reinforcing the possibility of Chilean or Patagonian roots. Some signs of physiological stress were present in her bones, possibly anemia or malnutrition at some point in life, though not severe enough to be fatal. These clues placed her within a population accustomed to hardship, but adapted to a seafaring lifestyle. The most striking aspect was not what the bones revealed, but what they implied. The presence of a young woman was an anomaly in sealing voyages. Crews were overwhelmingly male, drawn from ports across the Atlantic. While occasional records exist of women disguising themselves to travel or accompanying men unofficially, they were extremely rare in such harsh and profit-driven ventures. Her presence suggested circumstances outside the norm. She may have been a stowaway, a companion to a crew member, or perhaps forcibly brought along. There was no evidence of trauma that could clearly indicate cause of death. Her remains bore no weapon marks, and no injuries consistent with violent death were apparent. This silence left researchers with a spectrum of possibilities: illness during the voyage, exposure to the elements, or accidental death. Forensic study could only reconstruct so much. Beyond the biological facts lay a far more elusive story. Why was she there at all? The bones confirmed she had been part of Antarctica's earliest human presence, but they left her life's circumstances and final moments cloaked in mystery. Radiocarbon dating placed the woman's death between 1819 and 1825, a remarkably narrow window that coincides with one of the most pivotal moments in Antarctic history. The year 1819 is when the South Shetland Islands first entered the written record, after reports by British and Russian expeditions. Almost immediately, sealing crews descended upon the region, drawn by the abundance of fur seals. For a few years, these remote islands became the center of a sealing boom, with ships arriving from Britain, the United States, and South America. The dating suggested that this young woman lived and died at the very start of this chaotic period. To be present in the South Shetlands at that time meant she almost certainly arrived aboard a sealing vessel. Her ancestry provided another clue. Skeletal features consistent with mestizo origins pointed toward Chilean Patagonia or the southern channels of Tierra del Fuego. This matched historical patterns, since sealing ships operating out of South American ports often recruited local crew. Researchers considered the possibility that she may have been Yamana or Kaweskar, indigenous peoples of southern Chile known for their maritime skills. These groups had lived in harsh coastal environments for generations, navigating icy waters in small canoes. If she came from one of these communities, her presence on a sealing ship may not have been entirely accidental. However, historical records of women from these societies being taken aboard sealing expeditions are scarce. Another theory suggests she was mestizo from the Chilean coast, perhaps linked to one of the mixed communities that supplied sealers and sailors in the early 19th century. Either way, the Chilean connection was strong. Not only did her ancestry align with populations of southern South America, but the remains were discovered by a Chilean team more than 160 years later, almost as if history had circled back. Her story places South America, not Europe, at the center of Antarctica's earliest human chapter. Rather than a tale of imperial explorers claiming discovery, her presence suggests an untold dimension that ordinary, often overlooked individuals, sailors, laborers, and in this case, a young woman, were among the very first to leave human traces on Antarctic shores. The most difficult question surrounding the young woman's remains is how they came to rest on Yamana Beach. The forensic evidence establishes her age, ancestry, and approximate time of death, but the circumstances of her arrival remain uncertain. Several plausible theories have been proposed, each shedding light on the precarious nature of sealing expeditions and life at the southern edge of the world. One possibility is that she died aboard a sealing vessel and her body was consigned to the sea. Burial at sea was common practice for sailors and passengers who perished during voyages. In this scenario, currents could have carried her remains ashore, later scattered by waves and scavengers. However, the fact that her skull and femur fragments were found together suggests a more localized deposition rather than random drifting. Another hypothesis is abandonment. If she became gravely ill, incapacitated, or otherwise seen as a burden during the voyage, she may have been left behind on Livingston Island. The sealing industry was notorious for its brutal pragmatism, profit came before compassion, and ships often operated with little regard for the lives of crew. For a young woman to be stranded in such a hostile environment would almost certainly have meant a rapid death from exposure, starvation, or isolation. A third theory involves informal settlement or temporary camp activity. During sealing booms, crews often established makeshift shelters on the South Shetlands to process skins and oil. If she was present at such a camp, she may have died there, either through accident, illness, or neglect. The lack of a deliberate burial structure, however, points against a careful interment, suggesting instead that her remains were left unprotected, subject to weather and animal disturbance. Each possibility underscores the precarious human foothold in Antarctica's earliest days. Whether she was cast into the sea, abandoned, or died on shore, her story reflects the harshness of sealing life and the vulnerability of individuals caught within it. Theories abound, but none provide closure. Instead, they highlight the gulf between the historical record of exploration, dominated by ships, captains, and economic gains, and the hidden, unrecorded lives of those who perished on the margins of that story. To understand the young woman's presence, it is necessary to look at the sealing era itself. The South Shetland Islands, where her remains were found, were discovered in 1819 by William Smith, a British merchant sealer. Word of their abundant seal population spread quickly, and within months the islands became a hub of activity. Dozens of ships from Britain, the United States, and South America converged on the area, initiating one of the most intense but short-lived extraction booms in the southern hemisphere. The sealing industry was ruthless. Crews slaughtered thousands of fur seals for their pelts, stripping beaches bare in a matter of seasons. Temporary camps sprung up along the shores, where men skinned animals and stored goods before shipment. The work was dangerous, the environment hostile, and the voyages often chaotic. Records from the period describe overcrowded ships, outbreaks of disease, and frequent loss of life. Many vessels never returned. Although sealing was largely a male-dominated pursuit, it was not entirely without exceptions. Ships occasionally carried indigenous people from South America, valued for their skill in navigating and surviving cold coastal environments. There are fragmentary accounts of women accompanying expeditions, though usually as exceptions rather than norms. In some cases, women may have been brought involuntarily, tied to the darker realities of coercion and exploitation that accompanied maritime industries of the era. By the early 1820s, sealing in the South Shetlands was already in decline. The industry had been so intensive that seal populations collapsed within just a few years, forcing hunters to move further afield. As quickly as it had begun, the sealing rush ended, leaving little trace beyond abandoned camps and scattered records. Yet it is within this narrow window that the young woman's death occurred, suggesting that her story is inseparable from this brutal and short-lived industry. Her remains represent more than an isolated tragedy. They provide a rare, human dimension to an otherwise economic narrative. The sealing era was not only about profit and exploitation of animal populations. It was also about the lives risked and lost in pursuit of those profits, many of them forgotten, save for this one young woman whose bones survived against the odds. The discovery of the woman's remains carries a significance far beyond their biological details. Until the mid-1980s, the prevailing belief was that Antarctica's human history began with recorded expeditions of the early 19th century, European and American ventures that mapped coastlines and harvested seals. The bones from Yamana Beach challenged that assumption by providing physical proof of a human presence at the very edge of those first contacts. In archaeology, context is everything. Antarctica is a continent where human traces are vanishingly rare. Unlike other parts of the world, it holds no ancient settlements, no millennia-old tools, no deep cultural layers to study. Every find, therefore, becomes disproportionately important. The young woman's remains stand as the oldest directly recovered human bones on Antarctic soil. They expand the human timeline of the continent beyond logbooks and national claims into the realm of lived experience. Equally important is what her presence reveals about the scope of exploration. Historical accounts emphasize national expeditions and official voyages, but her story suggests that the earliest human footprint may belong not to celebrated explorers, but to ordinary, unnamed individuals swept along by economic currents. She embodies the reality that Antarctica's human story is not simply about discovery, but about the many lives, often marginalized, undocumented, and forgotten, that intersected with the continent in ways never recorded. The find also underscores the challenges of Antarctic archaeology. Extreme weather erases most traces of human activity. Bones, artifacts, and camp remains degrade quickly or are scattered by ice and wildlife. The fact that her skull and femur survived at all is remarkable. It suggests there may be other undiscovered traces of early visitors hidden in the ice or beneath the sand, awaiting future discoveries. Her remains remind us that Antarctica's human past is far from complete. For every log entry or expedition record preserved in archives, there are missing human stories, personal, vulnerable, and deeply human, that have yet to be uncovered. She represents one of the few tangible links between Antarctica's official history and the silent, unwritten lives that took part in shaping it. Scientific reports treat the young woman's remains as data: age, ancestry, diet, and cause of death left uncertain. But behind those details lies a human story that cannot be ignored. She was about 20 years old, in the prime of life, carried by circumstances that led her to one of the most remote and unforgiving environments on Earth. Whether she chose to be there or was taken against her will, her fate was sealed in a land where survival without support was nearly impossible. Imagining her presence changes the way we think of Antarctica. The continent is usually seen through the lens of great explorers and national expeditions: Cook, Shackleton, Amundsen, Scott. Yet long before those legendary journeys, this unnamed woman walked its beaches, a quiet figure in a forgotten chapter. She represents the ordinary and often overlooked people whose stories do not appear in history books, but are no less real. Her death also highlights the human cost of economic ventures like sealing. For most, the Antarctic was not a land of discovery, but of labor, risk, and exploitation. Sealing crews endured brutal conditions for profit, and lives were easily lost and forgotten. In her case, it was only by chance that her bones survived the passage of time, preserved in cold sands until their discovery over 160 years later. There is a poignancy in knowing that hers is the first human voice from Antarctica, though it speaks only in silence. Unlike later explorers who wrote diaries, drew maps, and left memorials, she left nothing but the remains of her body, eroded by wind and tide. Yet that silence carries its own message, that the history of human presence in Antarctica is not only about triumphs of endurance and exploration, but also about lives cut short, stories untold, and people erased from record. In many ways, she stands as a symbol of the hidden layers of history, those whose names were never recorded, whose contributions were never acknowledged, but whose existence adds depth and humanity to the story of exploration. Her bones transform a remote beach into a memorial, a reminder that Antarctica's past belongs not only to nations and explorers, but to forgotten individuals as well. Since their discovery, the remains of the young woman from Yamana Beach have continued to provoke debate and research. Forensic studies in the late 1980s and 1990s confirmed her age and ancestry, and later reviews have revisited the evidence with new methods. Some researchers suggested further DNA analysis could help pinpoint her origins more precisely, potentially linking her to indigenous populations of southern Chile. Yet, as with many archaeological finds in Antarctica, progress has been slow. The continent's strict protections under the Antarctic Treaty System mean that all human remains are treated with sensitivity, limiting invasive research. Theories about her presence remain open-ended. Was she part of a sealing crew from South America? Was she a companion, voluntary or otherwise, aboard a ship bound for the South Shetlands? Or was she perhaps one of the countless unnamed laborers swept into maritime industries during an era when survival often came second to profit? Each possibility underscores the uncertainty surrounding her life story. What is clear is that her discovery has reshaped how we view Antarctica's human timeline. No longer is the continent's history confined to the logbooks of explorers or the triumphs and tragedies of national expeditions. Her remains testify to an earlier, quieter human presence, one that was accidental, personal, and forgotten until rediscovered by chance. Her case has also influenced Antarctic archaeology more broadly. It demonstrated the value of investigating even the smallest traces of human activity, inspiring researchers to pay closer attention to subtle evidence, bones, tools, or even fragments of clothing that might otherwise be overlooked. It also highlighted the ethical responsibility of interpreting such finds respectfully, recognizing that behind each bone or artifact lies a human life once lived. And still, questions linger. Could future expeditions uncover more evidence of early human remains in Antarctica? Was she truly the first, or simply the first, whose bones survived long enough to be found? These unresolved mysteries keep her story alive, ensuring that she remains a figure not only of the past, but of ongoing inquiry into the boundaries of human history.